My father told me he was finally free of the burden, 30 seconds before the stock market decided my company was worth more than $1 billion. He didn't know that yet. At that exact moment, I was standing in a line of college graduates behind a stage at the University of Washington, wearing a stiff cardboard cap that kept sliding down my forehead while an announcer slowly called names through a loudspeaker. My phone vibrated in the pocket of my graduation gown. I pulled it out and read the message. "Good thing I'm finally free of the burden. You're on your own now." I read it twice. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stared at the concrete walkway in front of me while the line of students moved forward. My name is Emma Whitcomb. I was 23 years old that morning. And before this story continues, I should say something quickly for context. This story discusses family conflict, financial pressure, and the complicated ways parents and children sometimes misunderstand each other. Nothing here is meant to attack anyone personally. It's simply the story of how one moment at a graduation ceremony changed the way my family saw my life. The truth is, my father had believed for years that I was a bad investment. Not a failure exactly, just a poor return. The line shuffled forward. Students around me checked their phones, adjusted their caps, and whispered nervously to one another while families cheered from the stadium seats above. That was when my phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't a message. It was a call. Janet O'Neill, our chief financial officer at North Peak Security. I stepped a few feet away from the line before answering. Janet spoke with a controlled urgency. "Emma." The bell just rang. Trading opened at $42 a share. We didn't just cross the billion-dollar mark. The market is valuing us at $1.2 billion and climbing. You're officially the youngest female founder of a unicorn in Washington history. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I simply stood there holding the phone while the line of graduates continued moving slowly toward the stage. Behind me, a student leaned toward his friend and whispered, "Did she just say billion?" Within seconds, several people nearby were searching on their phones. One of them read a headline out loud. "Seattle cybersecurity company valued at $1 billion in public offering." I looked up toward the stands. My parents were sitting about halfway up in the stadium seats. My father was looking down at his phone, most likely rereading the message he had sent me a few minutes earlier. He still believed the story of my life had ended with a college diploma. Standing there in that graduation line, holding a phone that was suddenly lighting up with alerts from investors, reporters, and board members, I realized something simple. For my father, graduation meant the end of his investment. For me, it was the moment everything I had spent years building finally began. To explain why he sent that message and why it mattered more to me than the billion-dollar valuation, I have to go back several years. Back to Tacoma, Washington. Back to the way my father always calculated the value of a person the same way he calculated everything else. As an investment, I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, about 40 miles south of Seattle. My father, Richard Whitcomb, ran a construction company that built small commercial buildings and warehouses across the region. Most of my childhood revolved around his work schedule, even when we were not on job sites. My father believed in simple roles. Men built things. Sons inherited them. He rarely explained it out loud, but everyone in the house understood. I had 2 brothers. Grant was the oldest. By the time he was 19, he was already working full-time with my father's crews. My father liked the way Grant carried himself on job sites. He used to tell people, "That one understands how the real world works." Miles, my younger brother, followed the same path more quietly. He wasn't as confident as Grant, but he stayed close to the family business because that was the expectation. I didn't fit into that structure. Numbers made sense to me in a way construction never did. While my brother spent weekends measuring lumber or cleaning equipment, I spent hours solving math problems at the kitchen table. When I was 15, I won a statewide mathematics competition. My father drove me to the ceremony because my mother insisted he should be there after the awards were handed out. He shook my hand briefly. "A math trophy is a fine ornament." "Emma," he said, "but ornaments don't pour concrete or meet payroll. In the real world, if you can't build it with your hands, It's just a playground fantasy. Don't confuse a hobby with a career. People nearby smiled politely. If you didn't know him well, it almost sounded encouraging. Later that evening, I walked into the kitchen and heard him talking with one of his contractors. Girls like her cost more than they return, he remarked casually. The contractor chuckled as if it were a harmless joke. I stood in the hallway for a moment before quietly stepping back. Arguing wouldn't have changed anything. My father looked at everything the same way he looked at a construction project through the numbers. Investment, return, profit. In his mind, those calculations had already been completed. That was the first time I realized something clearly. I wasn't part of the future he had planned for our family. When the acceptance letter from the University of Washington's computer science program arrived, my father treated the news the same way he approached any construction contract. He didn't celebrate. He evaluated. We talked about it at the dinner table that evening. My mother explained the program carefully, like she was presenting a proposal. Grant leaned back in his chair, watching the conversation with mild curiosity. Miles focused on cutting his food into small pieces. My father read the letter once. Then he folded it neatly and placed it on the table. "I'll pay for 1 year," he said. The room stayed quiet. After that, he continued, "You handle the rest." My mother opened her mouth slightly as if she might respond, but she didn't interrupt. My father spoke in the calm, measured tone he used during meetings with contractors. "You keep your grades where they should be. If they slip, you come home and work in the office, payroll, scheduling, paperwork, something useful." I nodded. It felt less like approval and more like signing a contract. "Education is an investment," he added. "I'm giving you 1 year to prove it's worth it." A few weeks later, I walked into his office to borrow a stapler and noticed something in one of his accounting ledgers. There was a new entry written in clean block letters: Whitcomb Education Investment. Seeing it written that way didn't shock me as much as it probably should have. That was simply how my father saw the world. The night before I left for Seattle, my mother came quietly into my room after my bags were packed. She handed me a small envelope. "Keep this," she whispered. "Don't tell your father." Inside was a few $100s in cash. Not enough to change my situation, but enough to tell me that someone in the house believed I might actually need it. The next morning, my father drove me to the airport. We stood near the security line for a minute without speaking. Then he looked at me. "If this technology fantasy fails," he said, "don't expect rescue." I nodded once, picked up my bag, and walked toward the gate. By that point, I had already decided something important. I wasn't trying to convince him anymore. I was building something that would eventually make his calculations wrong. My first years in Seattle moved in a steady rhythm. Classes during the day, work at night. I took shifts at a small bookstore near the university district to cover rent and food. Most evenings, I returned to campus after closing and studied in quiet computer labs until early morning. The routine left almost no room for anything else, which was probably why the idea that became North Peak Security started as quietly as it did. It happened in a cryptography lab during my second year. I was studying how large companies implemented encryption systems, and one problem kept appearing. The mathematics behind the encryption was strong, but the systems surrounding it were far too complicated. Large corporations could hire specialists to manage those systems. Small companies couldn't. One afternoon, I mentioned the problem to a classmate. "There's nothing wrong with the math," I said. "The problem is the design." He shrugged. "Then redesign it." The idea stayed with me. Within a few weeks, I had a small group working on the concept with me. Tessa Rivera handled product design. Logan Shaw focused on the core software architecture. Daniel Park understood business strategy better than the rest of us. We met after classes in an empty lab room that smelled faintly like overheated electronics. "If we simplify deployment," Logan argued one night, pointing at a diagram on the whiteboard, "companies won't need specialized teams just to run encryption." Tessa nodded. "Then it becomes usable." Daniel leaned forward. "If it's usable, companies will actually buy it." That was the moment the project stopped being a class exercise. We named the company North Peak Security. The goal was simple: build encryption systems powerful enough for enterprise networks, but simple enough that ordinary companies could deploy them without an entire cybersecurity department. A few months later, our prototype won the university's startup competition. The prize was $50,000 in seed funding. For us, it felt enormous. I took a photo of the oversized check and sent it to my family. My father replied with one sentence: "Finish your degree before you embarrass yourself." I looked at the message for a moment. Then I closed the phone and went back to the lab. At the time, I believed that was the end of the conversation. In reality, it was only the beginning of the part where everything almost collapsed. North Peak's first customers were small financial firms willing to test early versions of our software. They weren't major contracts, but they proved something important. The product worked outside a university lab. For a few months, things felt stable. Then, one morning, everything nearly collapsed. A regional financial firm that had recently deployed our platform reported a cyber breach. At first, the details were unclear. Within hours, the story reached a technology blog. By the next morning, it reached the press. The headline was blunt: "Security startup linked to financial firm breach." The article didn't accuse us directly, but headlines rarely bother with nuance. Within 48 hours, the damage was already spreading. 2 angel investors suspended their funding. A pilot program we had been negotiating for months was canceled without explanation. Our operating account dropped below $10,000. The office atmosphere changed almost overnight. Logan stood in front of the whiteboard studying architecture diagrams for nearly an hour one afternoon before finally rubbing his forehead. "Emma," he said quietly, "we need to be absolutely sure this isn't structural." "I've checked the code," I replied, 3 times. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Investors won't care who caused the breach," he said. "They'll only see the headline." He didn't sound angry, just realistic. Sleep became difficult after that. I spent long nights in the office reviewing the system again and again, searching for some hidden flaw we might have missed. The encryption model still held. The math was still solid. The company, however, was still collapsing. After nearly 3 days without proper rest, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I called my father. I explained the situation as clearly as I could: the breach, the headlines, the investors pulling back. There was a short pause on the line. Then he spoke. "I told you that technology was a house of cards," he said. His voice sounded almost satisfied. "You spent 3 years chasing a ghost, and now the ghost has vanished." Another pause. "Come home to Tacoma. Emma, I still have a desk for you in the back office, if you're ready to stop playing CEO." The call ended less than a minute later. About a week after that conversation, I learned something else. Grant had started repeating the story around Tacoma. Apparently, he enjoyed telling people how my startup had already failed. By then, I had stopped expecting support from home. Still, hearing that version of the story spreading so easily left a quiet mark. For the first time since we started North Peak, I wondered whether my father's calculations might actually be right. After 2 nights without proper sleep, one fact became completely clear to me. The breach had nothing to do with our encryption. I had reviewed the entire system repeatedly, line by line, configuration by configuration. The architecture still held. The problem was proof. Technically, we were right. Publicly, we were already guilty. On the 3rd morning, an email appeared in my inbox. The sender was Catherine Brooks from Artemis Ventures. At first, I assumed it had been sent to the wrong company. Venture capital firms usually contacted startups that were rising, not ones currently featured in negative headlines. The message was brief. "I reviewed the breach report. Your client misconfigured the system. Your product worked exactly as designed. We should talk." That afternoon, we spoke by video call. Catherine had the calm, analytical tone of someone who trusted evidence more than opinions. Most investors stopped reading after the headline. She said, "I kept reading." Logan joined the call halfway through and began walking her through our system architecture. He shared diagrams, deployment logs, and the configuration steps the client had skipped. Catherine listened quietly for nearly 20 minutes. Then she asked several precise technical questions. When Logan finished explaining, she leaned back slightly. "The encryption model holds," she said. "Your client ignored two deployment requirements." Daniel, who had been silent for most of the meeting, glanced at me with cautious relief. But Catherine wasn't finished. "If Artemis considers an investment," she continued, "we'll need verification." Within the next week, her firm arranged a full technical audit. Independent cybersecurity analysts reviewed our architecture. Lawyers examined the breach claims. Public relations advisors studied the media coverage. The process was exhausting, but it produced something we desperately needed: evidence. When the audit concluded, Catherine called us again. "The system works exactly as you designed it," she said. Then she added the sentence that changed the trajectory of our company. "Artemis Ventures is prepared to invest $500,000 for 20% equity." Daniel nearly dropped his notebook. The funding itself mattered, but what mattered more was what came with it. Legal teams to address the breach claims, cybersecurity experts to publish the audit results, public relations advisors to correct the narrative. Within a few weeks, the public story began to shift. Independent analysts confirmed the breach had been caused by the client's own configuration mistakes. North Peak survived the moment that had nearly ended it. Before we finalized the investment agreement, Catherine left me with one thought that stayed with me for years. "You're not just writing software anymore," she said. "You're building a company." The next 7 years didn't feel dramatic while they were happening. There were no sudden victories, no headlines. Just long stretches of work that slowly transformed North Peak from a fragile startup into a real company. Looking back now, I can see the pattern clearly. At the time, it simply felt like survival. After the breach crisis, Catherine made one thing clear during our first board meeting: "Growth isn't the goal yet," she said calmly. "Stability is." Enterprise clients began testing the platform again, cautiously at first. Each contract came with stricter requirements than the last: security certifications, compliance reviews, independent audits. Each one forced us to refine the system further. Our first real enterprise deal came from a logistics company based in Seattle. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid reliably. Daniel walked into my office after the contract was signed and dropped the paperwork on my desk. "That," he said, "keeps the lights on." Catherine helped secure our next major milestone soon after: a Series A funding round worth $12 million. With that funding, we expanded the engineering team, built a proper sales department, and finally moved out of the cramped lab offices we had been using. By the 5th year, North Peak employed more than 60 people. That was when I discovered something uncomfortable. Building the technology had been the easy part. Running the company was far more complicated. Catherine introduced me to someone who would eventually become essential to North Peak's survival: Janet O'Neill. Janet had helped guide several technology firms through acquisitions and public offerings. When she visited our office for the first time, she reviewed our financial records in complete silence. Then she closed the folder slowly. "You've built something impressive," she said, "but the structure behind it is fragile." Within months, she reorganized almost everything: reporting systems, financial controls, governance policies. The changes were exhausting, but they made the company stronger. 2 years later, the board began discussing an idea I once would have dismissed as impossible: taking North Peak public. During those same years, I continued finishing my degree part-time. Graduating had stopped being a practical necessity. It had become a promise I had made to myself. My family, meanwhile, rarely asked about the company. When I tried explaining our work, the conversations usually drifted somewhere else: construction schedules, local politics, weather reports. Once my father visited the North Peak office in Seattle. He walked through the building quietly while engineers worked at their desks, whiteboards covered with encryption diagrams and deployment models. After about 10 minutes, he stopped beside me. "Looks expensive," he said. Then he glanced around the office again. "Let's see if it survives a real market." I nodded once. By that point, I had already learned something important. Explaining rarely changed his expectations. The week of my graduation arrived at almost the same time North Peak's bankers were finalizing the pricing for our public offering. The timing wasn't intentional, but once it happened, there was no separating the two events. My family drove up from Tacoma for the ceremony. We met for dinner the evening they arrived. The conversation started politely, the way family conversations often do when everyone is avoiding certain subjects. My father eventually asked about the company. His tone sounded exactly like it did when he reviewed construction bids. "So, how much of it do you actually own?" "Enough to stay involved," I replied. Grant leaned back in his chair and smiled slightly. "If this thing actually goes public," he said, "maybe I should buy shares early." My mother spoke before anyone else could respond. "Emma, just make sure nothing embarrassing happens during graduation. Your father has friends watching." I nodded. By then, I understood that in our family, embarrassment had very little to do with reality. Later that evening, my father asked me to meet him in the hotel lobby. He was sitting alone at a small table when I arrived. His hands were folded neatly in front of him. "When you're on that stage tomorrow," he said, "people will be watching. Some of them know me." He paused for a moment. "Make sure they understand where you started." I looked at him quietly. "You paid for 1 year of tuition," I said. "I built the rest." For a few seconds he held my gaze. Then he stood up without responding and walked toward the elevators. Later that night, while walking past the hallway outside my parents' room, I heard Grant speaking inside. "If she gets famous tomorrow," he said, "people should know you raised her right." My father didn't argue with that. The conversation ended shortly after. The next morning, I woke early for the ceremony. Graduation gowns hung across chairs in the hotel room. My phone buzzed on the nightstand while I was getting ready. A new message had arrived. It was from my father. When I stepped out of the graduation line to answer Janet's call, I still hadn't responded to my father's message. The phone felt warm in my hand. His words were still on the screen. "Good thing I'm finally free of the burden. You're on your own now." Janet didn't waste time. "The banks finished pricing this morning," she said. "North Peak's valuation just crossed $1 billion. For a moment, I didn't reply. The sounds of the stadium applause, announcements, the shuffle of hundreds of graduates continued around me while the words settled in. "1 billion, I asked quietly. "That's the number," Janet confirmed. "Trading starts soon. The board wanted you to know immediately." I thanked her and ended the call. By then, a few students nearby had noticed the conversation. One of them leaned toward his friend. "Did she just say billion?" The other student was already searching on his phone. Within a minute, someone read a headline aloud. "Seattle cybersecurity company valued at $1 billion in public offering." A few heads turned toward me. I hadn't meant to attract attention, but information spreads quickly in a crowd. I looked up toward the stadium seats. My parents were sitting about halfway up. My father wasn't watching the stage anymore. He was leaning toward the man next to him, staring down at a phone screen. Even from that distance, I could see the shift in his expression. At first, he looked confused. Then he became very still. A moment later, the announcer's voice echoed across the stadium. "Emma Whitcomb." I stepped forward. The walk across the stage lasted only a few seconds, the same as it did for every other graduate, but my phone vibrated repeatedly in my pocket alerts from financial outlets, investors, and board members reacting to the market opening. The dean handed me my diploma. Cameras flashed. Applause echoed through the stadium. Somewhere above the stage, I knew my father was still looking at that phone screen, trying to decide whether the number in front of him was real. When I returned to the line of graduates, I glanced back toward the stands. He was still staring at the screen. For the first time in my life, the calculations he trusted so much were telling him something he hadn't expected. That evening, we met for dinner near Lake Union. The table stayed quiet for several minutes. Everyone had seen the news by then, but no one seemed certain how to begin the conversation. My father finally looked at me. Why didn't you tell us about the company? I kept my voice calm. I tried. I said. You just never asked twice. Grant leaned forward slightly. So, if the company's worth that much now, he said, could someone still buy shares privately? Not from me, I replied. Miles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I should have backed you earlier, he admitted. I just didn't want the argument. My father didn't respond. For the first time I could remember, he seemed unsure what position he held in the conversation. The man who had always evaluated everything through numbers and certainty was now sitting quietly across the table from something he had never calculated. A few weeks later, after the public offering stabilized, I transferred $50 million in company shares into a scholarship program. We called it the North Peak Fellowship. The goal was simple: help young women enter cybersecurity without needing anyone's permission to try. One evening, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from my father. Saw your interview. You spoke well. No apology. Just acknowledgement. I read the message once, then set the phone down. For most of my life, I had waited for a moment when my father might finally understand the path I had chosen. By then, I had realized something more important. I no longer needed him to. Sometimes the hardest part of building something isn't the work itself. It's continuing when the people closest to you don't believe in what you're doing. Many of us grow up with expectations placed on us about what kind of career is practical, what success should look like, or whose approval matters most. And when our path doesn't match that blueprint, it can feel like we're constantly trying to prove our worth. But real progress rarely begins with approval. It usually begins with persistence. Emma's story isn't really about a billion-dollar company. It's about staying focused long enough for your work to speak for itself, even when others don't see the value yet. Over time, consistent effort has a way of rewriting the story people once believed about you. If this story reminded you of a moment in your own life when you had to keep going without encouragement, feel free to share it in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about resilience, family, and finding your own path, consider subscribing for more.